Origin Jams Home Studio Rex, and this is real stories from the cockpit of the untouchable SR-71 Blackbird. This will tell know what you think. Yes, been a while since I didn't know what you think video. Yeah, stories from SR-71. This is gonna be good because SR-71 was like one of those insane planes of the past. SR-72, as far as I know, is like like drone style, like unmanned plane. So SR-71 was like a thing of its own, and it's gonna be unbeaten, right? Because no other squad person, whatever you want to call it, will ever ride a plane like that. So the people who actually flew those planes, the stories must be some insane things, because like that kind of insane speed, outrunning everything, spying, right, staying there a long time, right, because like refueling and everything, they were in the air for a long time, right? And like disintegrating thing, like a lot of planes also disintegrated. That's how fast they were, like maintenance and everything. Imagine, it's like closest equivalent on the ground I can think of is like those like jet power roadster that people make, very thin tires in front, a very raggedy looking car with a jet engine behind, going to the insane speed like 300 miles per hour, some shit like that. It's shit like that, right? Like basically, like any moment something can go wrong type of way. So this was that, like like in the edge of what is possible with a plane at the time. So it's gonna be interesting. Let's watch it.
On July 26, 1968, an SR-71 was flying over northern Vietnam when the Reconnaissance Systems Officer, or RSO, noticed an R light pop up on his panel, which meant that the North Vietnamese surface-to-air missile site was searching for the Blackbird on its radar. But the RSO wasn't worried. This was a frequent occurrence. Shortly after, he noticed an M light illuminate, which meant that the Vietnamese radar was tracking them. That was uncommon, to say the least. But what happened next was arguably the longest minute of the crew's life. While the Blackbird was traveling at 83,000 feet at Mach 3 over Hanoi, the RSO noticed an L light pop up on its electronic countermeasures panel. The L meant that one or more missiles had been fired at the aircraft. The atmosphere inside the cabin became critical once the pilot asked the RSO when the L light was illuminated. It had been a minute. The time was important because the flight time of the SA-2 surface-to-air missiles was only 58 seconds. Upon landing, the cameras later confirmed that 2 missiles had been fired, and that was the first time ever that a missile had been launched toward a Blackbird. Over the years, more than 4,000 missiles were fired at Blackbirds, but none of them ever hit the target. But why it took 2 Buicks to start the SR-71? How the Blackbird could take pictures that were not blurry, even though it flew at 3 times the speed of sound? What design feature capped the airplane's maximum speed? And why it was not fuel, but liquid nitrogen that restricted the combat range of the SR-71 is not what you think. Even though not a single Blackbird was ever shot down by the enemy, about a third of the SR-71 fleet was destroyed during freak accidents. Some people even came to believe that flying the Blackbird was basically a continuous series of emergency procedures. But the reality was the opposite. She was quite a reliable machine. Everything worked flawlessly in unison, pretty much all of the time. It's just that when things went wrong at Mach 3, it produced some memorable...
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Like we are talking about such an intense scenarios. We are talking about the edge of what is possible. So when shit goes, it's like basically a spacecraft, right? Going to space, Apollo mission. Everything we use today comes from Apollo mission. That's how advanced they were. But like, a lot of them got destroyed, and when shit went wrong, it really went wrong, because we are at the edge of things, right? It's like things work 99.8% of time, let's just say, but those last 0.2%, when that shit goes, is over, right? So something like that. It's just a lot of Blackbird just disintegrated just by like how fast they were, right? Because everything, material science wasn't that good back then compared to today. If they made Blackbird today, same Blackbird, they're making SR-72, that's different. But if they made the same Blackbird today, it wouldn't have such a failure rate because of like material science that we have today, right? But back then, like everything was such a like high tech, but still, when shit went wrong, it went wrong.
moments for the pilots. If there was something wrong during the flight, pilots felt it right away since they knew every little flicker, rubble, or wriggle of the aircraft and what it meant. Nevertheless, if something went wrong, a master caution light would turn on. To know what was wrong, the pilot had to look at a panel that was between his legs. This panel had about 40 or so individual lights that pointed exactly to what was wrong. Here is one such story. On April 9, 1982, Colonel Lee Shelton and Major Bill Keller took off from Beale Air Force Base on an SR-71 airframe that was coming off from several years of deep storage. Everything went smoothly, until at Mach 3 at 71,000 feet, the master caution light came on. The pilots were surprised by it, because normally they'll be dealing with an emergency before the master caution light had come on. Looking at the panel of 40 lights, it indicated the System A flight hydraulic failure. Luckily, there were two independent hydraulic systems on the Blackbird, System A and B. But in case one failed, the procedure was to land as quickly as possible after dumping some fuel. As the pilot was descending, the master caution light came on again, indicating System B flight hydraulic failure. At this point, both crew went, "Oh shit," because the emergency procedure for when both hydraulic systems fail is to immediately eject.
I mean, yeah, there are two hydraulic systems, both fail. Like, okay, so either eject or go down with it. Like, what else are you gonna do? It's like steering, failing. You can't steer now, so what you gonna do?
But because they still had some control of the aircraft, they were able to continue flying and headed toward Beale Air Force Base to avoid ejecting.
That takes balls.
Once they reached 30 miles north of the airbase, they contacted the tower, letting them know that they had dual flight control hydraulic failure. The tower mirrored the crew's reaction. "Oh shit!" As the Blackbird crossed the runway threshold, the remaining pressure in System B hydraulic system was virtually zero, with the aircraft barely being controllable. Nevertheless, they landed safely. It turned out
If hydraulics have no pressure, they could flop around. Like, that was a massive risk, man. What if it I mean, I get it, like, it was stable enough that they just went straight down, but that's the point. Hydraulics had no pressure, so what if flopped around, like, lose control that way? That was a major risk, man. They could have died.
that the hydraulic seals in both A and B systems had failed, and out of the 6 gallons of hydraulic fuel, only a few cups were left in the system. But the crew wasn't always that lucky. When a similar incident happened on April 21, 1989, the crew of an SR-71 had to eject because a hydraulic failure made the aircraft uncontrollable. The pilot and the RSO were successfully rescued near the Philippines, and the aircraft was later salvaged by the US Navy. But what was the SR-71 doing near the Philippines?
Spy things.
There were 2 main operating detachments for the Blackbird, Det 1 at Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa, Japan, and Det 4 at Mildenhall Royal Air Force Base in England. Usually, there would be 3 Blackbirds stationed at each of the detachments. The missions that were flown out of Japan were different from the missions flown out of England. In fact, the weather and flying missions for both detachments were on the opposite sides of the spectrum, since their geographies was very different. Det 1 flew missions over North Korea, Vietnam, and eastern outskirts of the Soviet Union, while Det 4 flew near the western areas of the Soviet Union, primarily in the area of Barents Sea, since their goal was to spy on the Soviet fleet of nuclear submarines.
Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing near Arctic, where Russia's whole fleet is, right? That's very different place to fly with everything, right? Like conditions and everything compared to like North Korea and things like that. So I guess they had to like really tune it out that way.
According to pilots, the most dangerous missions were the ones flown next to Murmansk submarine base, over the Barents Sea. The pilots feared that if something went wrong, say an engine problem, that it would have to go down to subsonic speeds, which made them an easy prey for Soviet MiGs. For this reason, all new crews were required to fly their first missions from Japan before they could fly any missions out of the UK. Of course, becoming a Blackbird pilot was incredibly difficult and competitive. On average, only 2 or 3 pilots were selected into the program each year. The physical requirements to join the program were believed to be on par with that of astronauts. But before flying any operational sorties, the pilots first had to fly a very special variant of the Blackbird for about 100 hours. The SR-71B was the training variant of the Blackbird and had a raised cockpit for an instructor, making it the fastest classroom in the sky. In its 30 years of service, only 100
This is like somebody training somebody how to shoot a gun, and rather than going to like shooting practice, going to the war, because it's physics. You can't change the physics. If you want to learn how to fly fast, you need to learn how to fly fast. Oh, by the way, you're doing it wrong, man. We are at Mach 3, by the way. Okay, let's correct it in milliseconds. Because if you fuck it up, we are all dust in the air, I guess. We're flying Mach 3.
50 aviators qualified to fly the SR-71, all of which were trained on one of the only 2 airframes of the SR-71B that were ever built. In fact, the SR-71B Blackbird with tail number 617956 was a record holder, having completed 1,454 flights and logged over 3,900 flight hours, more than any other SR-71 in history. But what if I told you that you could own a piece of that historic airplane? This is Habu. Not only does its crown resemble the SR-71's dual-engine inlet cones, this limited edition timepiece incorporates actual materials from the SR-71B with tail number 617956. The lower dial is fashioned from the aircraft's inner engine nacelle exhaust ejectors, while the top dial draws.
Wait a minute, how much it cost? If it doesn't cost much, it's like, if you're going to use actual piece from that plane, like it has to be costly, right?
Inspiration from the Blackbird's exhaust flaps. The face of the watch echoes the Blackbird's cockpit gauges. The power reserve indicator mimics the triethyl-borane throttle system that the Blackbird needed for ignition at high speeds. Brushed hour and minute hands reflect the aircraft's silhouette from above. And the FKM double-injection rubber straps mirrors the red nose-step zones from the Blackbird's fuselage. Habu has a commanding presence, yet remains lightweight and exceptionally comfortable on the wrist. So use the code NWYT to pre-order your limited edition watch using the link in the description. This masterpiece is more than just a watch. It's a story waiting to be told. Out of the 29 SR-71A,
it better be costly, right? Because otherwise it's like an insult to SR-71. You're going to use actual piece of that's rare.
variants, only 10 airframes were in active service. The other 19 aircraft were in maintenance, as Lockheed engineers took the aircraft apart and put it back together, or placed them in deep storage. But why did they keep some aircraft in storage? Well, it was to make sure that all airframes aged at the same time, which is why all the aircraft were periodically rotated in and out of storage. This worked out pretty well, and by the time the Blackbirds were retired, the average airframe had accumulated 2,300 hours, with only a few hundred hours separating the high and low time birds. One of the most exhilarating things you could do with the SR-71.
What the look at that. I love this. This is so good. Back up. Look at that. Just imagine you're standing there at night. It's pitch dark because of course it is. It's nighttime. This ain't a video game. It's real life. Blackbird being black, that's the whole thing. You can't really see it, and then there's those 2 blue lights shoot out at that far apart. You're like, what the fuck? That is some sight right there. Look at that. Black, especially back then, like Blackbird. Everybody like Blackbird. Blackbird was such like a instant star at that point, right? You have this plane that is so powerful, like so fast, Mach 3 plus, that disintegrated a lot of times. And obviously, like we're doing a rotating thing. That just makes sense. Anybody who's ever built a PC, even they know, like when it comes to PC, if your like RAM motherboard starts to like wear out, usually try to like sell things you already haven't built the whole PC from start, right? Because if you just replace a part, it's like, that's just like, another thing will go on, then another thing will go off, like it will just constant repair. So it's best to just like replace everything. I'm guessing that was the case with the plane. I know it's a weird analogy, but this is the one thing people can relate to, I guess, when it comes to like anything similar, computers and shit like that happen a lot, right? uh, I would have given like car analogy, but nowadays cars are different. You can swap parts and it will be reliable. But like 30 years ago, cars were like that. Like if you swap certain things, might as well swap everything, because like things will start to go off if you don't, right? All you'll do is just replace things.
SR-71 was to fly it across the Terminator, the division line between day and night. When you fly higher at an altitude of 80,000 feet, the Terminator is even more pronounced than at sea level. The Blackbird pilots would compare heading toward the Terminator from the light to flying into a black wall. During one winter mission over the Arctic Ocean, due to its high speed, an SR-71 managed to cross the Terminator 6 times in 1 hour, meaning that the crew experienced 3 sunsets and 3 sunrises in just 60 minutes. And sometimes they would have 2 breakfasts in a day. See, each pilot's tour lasted about 6 weeks, which happened 4 to 6 times per year. This meant that the SR-71 pilots had to endure the ultra-boring, most uncomfortable commute known to mankind from Beale Air Force Base to one of their detachments at the back of a KC-135Q tanker. Depending on where the mission took place, the pilot's commute was somewhere between 12 to 24 hours. The alternative was a glowing heat mission, which involved flying an SR-71 at Mach 3 to its area of deployment. Glowing heat missions would happen once an SR-71 had undergone scheduled maintenance and needed to be returned to its assigned detachment. Everyone, of course, favored the glowing heat sorties. Not only was it faster, but also the pilots would eat breakfast at Beale Air Force Base, then light the burners, and after 7 hours, eat breakfast again at Kadena Air Force Base in Japan. You could say the SR-71 was a high...
All of that. They eat breakfast and then fly that much, and then eat. So I guess they got accustomed to eating food and like flying at this high speeds. Because I would think like, okay, if you're gonna fly like 2.5, 3 Mach or something, like you're gonna keep your stomach somewhat empty or something. I don't know.
Maintenance bird. Each time it took about 18 to 20 hours to make the aircraft ready for the crew. This included avionics specialists uploading mission information into the aircraft. It took a crew of 16 a few hours to inspect every area of the airplane prior to each flight. Then 4 people would spend an hour to fuel the aircraft. The aircrew arrived at the hangar 40 minutes before the scheduled takeoff time. Prior to each flight, the spikes were tested to ensure they would extend and retract within 1/10 of an inch of each other. This was important to ensure that supersonic shock waves would form equally on both sides of the aircraft. Otherwise, it would have caused an aerodynamic disturbance. Each spike was responsible for holding a shock wave in place.
And not to mention, if like one does shockwave first than the other, it would like basically internally damage the plane, right? So it has to be like equal times.
By moving horizontally up to 26 inches. That's because at 80,000 feet, the air is too thin, and the faster you go, the more air and fuel the engines require. And retracting the spikes at higher speeds allowed more air in. The movement of the spikes also kept the shock waves from being engulfed by the inlets, because if a shock wave entered the inlets, it would have hit the first rows of compressor blades with such force that it would have instantly destroyed the engines. Speaking of engines, the Blackbird's J58 engines did not have a starter, so an AG330 start truck nicknamed Buick was used to start the engine. Originally, inside a start cart, there were 2 Buick V8 engines mounted in tandem with automatic transmission that had a vertical drive shaft which was inserted inside the Blackbird's engine. Each engine required 1 Buick cart to start, and it was incredibly loud since the engines had no mufflers. The limiting factor in flying the SR-71 at Mach 3...
That's like saying F1 car doesn't have a muffler. Why would it? Like, it's not supposed to be quiet. Like, the quietness is not important at that point, right? I mean, I would say like, oh, wait a minute. Couldn't they have figured out a way to give it its own, like, a starter? Why use Buick engine? But, like, we are talking about here, like, a thing with a purpose. SR-71 has a purpose. Spy plane. It's supposed to go insanely fast, spy, that's it. Anything else needs to be cut off. Same thing applies to like F1 cars and things like that, right? So they could have given it something like it's an insanely costly plane. They are not cost saving here. They could have given us something like a starter or something by its own, but then it's like it's part of the plane, it's lugging around, like it's making it heavy. They're trying to make the plane as light as possible, as stealthy as, not stealthy, but black and all that, like painted like stealth as they can, fast as they can. There was a reason why it was like kind of disintegrated, because if they made it more robust, it would have been heavier. So that's like counterintuitive, right? So yeah, so whenever people like I see a comment like that 2 months like, oh, the multi-billion-dollar, $1 trillion investment, this and that and all that shit, but they couldn't have given it like this and that. Like I hear like that a lot. Like I see comments like that a lot. You need to see beyond that. Like, what is the reason behind this? What are they doing? Right? This is not a leisure or commercial plane, right? This is a military proper plane with a purpose.
Was not the amount of fuel, but the amount of liquid nitrogen which was required. See, as the fuel was consumed, fuel vapors would fill the top of the tank, which could ignite, since during Mach 3 flights, the fuel tank heated up to 300 degrees Fahrenheit. For example, on July 17, 1996, a TWA Boeing 747 exploded 13 minutes after taking off from New York due to fuel vapor ignition inside the center fuel tank.
747.
Therefore, to prevent the Blackbird from exploding, the solution was to purge fuel vapor.
I mean, when it comes to Boeing, 737s are cursed, but 747 is like fairly reliable, right? Like it doesn't have that much issue. But I guess that's not the issue. It's like literal engineering hurdle that they didn't thought of before it happened. Now they thought of it. It's not like the door fall off or something. So 747, I'm pretty sure is like reliable enough.
Vapors and replace them with inert nitrogen gas. A heater would convert the liquid nitrogen into gas, which then circulated throughout the fuel system. But during aerial refueling, the nitrogen was vented out of the fuel tanks whenever the tank's pressure exceeded 6 psi. The thing is, there were only two 27.5-gallon liquid nitrogen tanks on the Blackbird, so the airplane's range was limited by the amount of liquid nitrogen inside the tanks. Later on, a 13-gallon additional tank was installed to extend the range of the aircraft. It's true that the SR-71 Blackbird leaked fuel, and it's also true that the aircraft would always perform aerial refueling shortly after takeoff.
Wait a minute, I'm pretty sure Blackbird didn't. They just pour, pour the fuel inside the fuselage or something. Like it didn't have like its own dedicated tank for weight saving or something, and because of it, it was like always creaked through or so, right? I'm pretty sure I remember that. Which I think it was from the Know What You Think, or I don't know which channel it was like, but something like that. Which again, when you think about it, like okay, makes sense, like trying to save weight and things.
But it's a myth that the aerial refueling was due to the amount of fuel leak. The Blackbirds refueled shortly after takeoff for two main reasons. The first was due to weight. When the aircraft was fully loaded with 80,000 pounds of fuel, it could damage the landing gears during taxiing and takeoff. This was learned the hard way, so they instead took off with about half a tank and refueled once airborne. The second reason was for practice, because besides the 29 operational SR-71As, there were also 35 KC-135Q tankers that needed to practice mating with the Blackbird.
Hold up there. Let's say it fills up the tank, 40 tons or whatever, like fills up the tank fully, right? But now something emergency happens and they have to land. Tank is full. Won't that cause issues like they couldn't land now? You'd say like, okay, but they could just dump the fuel, but dumping that much fuel itself takes time. But what if they immediately have to land? At that point, they're crashing. Is that it? I guess like, but even then, like, what if they don't have runway? They can't just land anywhere, so maybe they're crashing anyway.
The SR-71 was a spy plane, so it was equipped with a state-of-the-art camera for its time. From 85,000 feet, this camera was able to take a picture of a 6-inch object from 85,000 feet. But before the camera could snap a photo, there were two big problems that needed to be resolved.
Wait a minute, did NASA help with that? I bet they did, right? NASA was probably involved in this one. Oh, we need a big-ass camera that looks down and takes photos. NASA's like, we can help this. But then again, like, even before NASA, I'm pretty sure, like, Air Force themselves with the, like, spy satellites and things, right? Because Hubble wasn't the first. Air Force or, like, space force that is part of the Air Force. That it was not called Space Force. What is it called? A space something, right? Which basically satellite department, which was part of the Air Force. Right now they're separating it, but it's part of the Air Force. So they already put like a state of the art, satellite on top, looking down and taking pictures. Basically, Hubble was just that, but like looking up now with bit tweaks. But NASA people helped with the spy satellite, but defense budget is much higher than the NASA one, so like they are always the first.
The first issue was air conditioning for the camera when the airplane flew at its maximum speed, and heating for the camera when the spy plane traveled at subsonic speeds, say during aerial refueling. But a much bigger problem was the Blackbird's speed. At cruising speed, the SR-71 would move 3,000 feet per second. This meant that if the camera took a picture with a shutter speed of 1 millisecond, the aircraft would have traveled 3 feet during exposure. But in reality, the exposure time was much slower. The aircraft would move about 742 feet during slow mode exposure and 371 feet during fast exposure settings, and this would result in blurry images that were unusable. The solution was a gimbaled mirror which moved precisely to compensate for the SR-71's forward speed. But how fast did the Blackbird exactly go?
Wait a minute, couldn't they have solved that with like I guess they didn't have the technology, but like have a better like higher resolution sensor, but not so zoomed in optics, right? But because if you like zoom all the way up to like a 3 feet or whatever it was and just try to take that, yeah, shutter speed is an issue. But if you like have a higher resolution sensor that takes much higher resolution picture, but like zoomed out a bit, like let's say now you can take 100 feet photo, a bit of like change doesn't matter because you're taking the whole area, so you can just like cut a piece of that and there's the photo. If you're a higher sensor, you can do that, right? Basically, if you're like a real 100 megapixel sensor compared to 10 megapixel, you don't need a 10x zoom. You can just take it and like crop it, right? If it's proper, like not like smartphone type 100 megapixel, like like pixel to pixel type of way, pixel size to pixel size.
The official unclassified answer was that the SR-71 was capable of Mach 3+. The aircraft was designed for Mach 3.2. However, its normal operating speed was Mach 3.17. With regards to the maximum altitude, officially it was 85,000 feet, with some sources saying that the Blackbird was capable of flying at 100,000 feet and even higher. The reality was that the aircraft could fly faster and higher, but its speed was limited by the compressor inlet temperature, which maxed out at 800 degrees Fahrenheit. This meant that depending on the outside ambient temperature, the Blackbird sometimes flew slower or faster. But in case of emergency, the crew of SR-71 were allowed to use tactical limits, in other words, pushing the aircraft to its maximum speed. The alternative of being shot down by a missile outweighed all the negatives of maxing out the aircraft. This meant that the inlet temperature could reach 842 degrees Fahrenheit for up to 1 hour at a time, but they were never allowed to exceed Mach 3.3. Interestingly, during the record-breaking flight across the United States from coast to coast, the crew originally asked if they could fly at Mach 3.5, which would have meant a coast-to-coast flight in under 60 minutes. But Lockheed said it was a bad idea, because if engine on-start occurred at speeds above Mach 3.3, the crew may not have been able to keep the pointy end forward. So they ended up doing the record-breaking coast-to-coast flight at Mach 3.3, which took them 67 minutes and
yeah, if shit goes down at 3.5 Mach and it just like points down, you don't have enough time to eject. And I don't think you can eject at that Mach speed. If you wait to slow down, you might just crash. Like, yeah, we're talking about insane speeds right here.
54 seconds. There is only one documented occasion where a Blackbird pilot claimed to hit Mach 3.49 because the temperature of the inlet was far below the 800 degrees Fahrenheit threshold due to a cold snap near Murmansk. But the theoretical maximum speed of the Blackbird was Mach 3.55, because at that speed, the spikes would have been fully retracted and lost their ability to interact with the shock waves.
Yep, there you go. Yeah, when we look, man, F-15 is like 2.5 mark, right? Like, right, something like that. Was it 2.8 mark? Wait a minute, I need to see this one. Yeah, so F-15 is 2.5 Mach, while F-22 is 2.2 Mach. For obvious reason, it's like a stealthier plane. But F-15 is 2.5 Mach. You would think like 3 Mach. It's like just half Mach more. Like, I mean, if F-15 is properly reliable, doesn't need all these procedures like you go into spacecraft with all this like fucking checks and things, and it can go 2.5 Mach. Why is 3 Mach that much? It's a half a Mach. But people need to realize the more faster you go in air, the air starts to become thicker and thicker. It's like a soup, right? Now, Bugatti Veyron, right? It did, what was it, like 245 or was it 241 miles per hour or something like that, right? Or was it something like that, 240 or 250 miles per hour, something like that. I think it was 250 or something, right? But then they added 200 more horsepower into that 1000 horsepower, made a 1200 horsepower Veyron Super Sport. So it can do 15 or 17 miles per hour more. 200 horsepower, just 50 miles per hour, because at that speed, pushing even more is even more ridiculous, right? So something like that, like yes, F-15 can do 2.5 Mach, but going to 3 Mach, that half Mach, not to mention 3.5 Mach, which is its top speed, that is some insane numbers, especially cut through the air. Right? Now imagine going even more like 4 Mach, 5 Mach. We're talking about ridiculous craziness here. But deadly problems, right? Because if something goes wrong, they're basically a mist, right? You know that Top Gun Maverick scene of the start where he goes to what, 9 Mach or something? Like, okay, he goes to 9 Mach or something, just like disintegrates and somehow survives, right? That shit would happen at 4 or 5 Mach if like some plane would go and something goes wrong, right? So, you know, it exponentially go higher the more faster you go, right? It's not linear like that. Alright, well, that was real stories from the cockpit of the Untouchable SR-71 Blackbird. Watch, I know what you think. If you like my content, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.